Welcome everyone, Christine here with my High Elf meta guide for Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. In this video, I want to talk about how to play them, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, what are the things you should prioritize in your campaign from all perspectives. Lords, heroes, army rosters, economy, even research, though research is pretty straightforward when it comes to the High Elves because of the restrictions that you do have on it. But the High Elves are one of the strongest races in the game. However, unlike, say, the Warriors of Chaos or Greenskins, which start very strong, the High Elves take some time to get going. This is one of the issues in Imric's campaign, because his growth potential, as it were, is limited by the territory he's in and the issues he has in his campaign, whereas someone like Tyrion, Alariel, Elfarion, and even Teclis have a lot more potential in their campaigns, and also Alivanar, of course. So that's something to bear in mind if you're going to be playing a High Elven campaign, that the early game situation is not your full strength, that you unlock that as you play more through the campaign, as you grow settlements to a higher level, as you get more structures, as you get more research. Though to be clear, even at the beginning of a campaign, they will have a good amount of power through their spearmen and their archers, which also scale very well in the end game. There's actually very few units in the game which you start with and you can use throughout the entirety of your campaign and have them still being effective. So spearmen are effective because they're a good unit to hold the line with. They have a good amount of charge defense, they can charge reflection even, they have charge defense bonus versus large, they have a decent amount of armor, and they have a silver shield, so they're actually quite resistant to enemy range units. And then archers, specifically archers with light armor that you should battle with, they have a ridiculously high range, decent amount of damage, decent level of armor. So pretty good units all around. There's many units that have significantly lower armor than these guys. That might do more damage, but just because they have low armor, they won't be quite as effective in battle. And then of course you have pretty good endgame choices, pretty good lords, pretty good heroes, pretty good units that are available over there. To start with unit recruitment, at any tier 1 settlement you can recruit archers and spearmen. Now the spearmen are a very good, cost-effective unit that is great in battles in terms of holding a line. They won't do a lot of damage, they have a bonus against large, but their primary role is to hold the line against attackers to let your archers basically kill everything. Not effective in sieges though, unfortunately, because if you send these guys through a gate, if you send them on the wall, they're just gonna get annihilated during the siege. Archers without armor, pretty effective unit, very good range, but from my perspective, they're generally not worth using, because the regular archers with light armor, they're only 12 more upkeep. Yes, a bit more expensive to recruit, a bit more expensive to maintain, and obviously if you're building a lot of armies on the campaign map, that will add up. But I would personally argue that as long as you can recruit archers with light armor, then recruiting regular archers is just not worth it. Pay the bit of extra money, you'll get a much better unit, and crucially, because these guys have better armor, they'll actually do a lot better in auto-resolve as well, so speeding up your campaign. Then you also have rangers at tier 1 with the Elfarion DLC. Now, to understand what rangers are, they're basically the nasty skulker version for the High Elves. Not as good in terms of scalability, in terms of late game potential as nasty skulkers are, but still a fairly effective unit early on. They can take a lot of damage because they have low armor, though they do have a good amount of physical resistance. These guys won't do well in auto-resolve, in point of fact, because you're using a combined army of melee and ranged, and you'll probably be using more range. Your melee units in general will take quite a bit more damage, so just be aware of that situation. But when it comes to their battle situation, like a melee combination of spearmen and rangers to deal damage is actually quite effective in the early game. Late game problems though, but they do have a fairly good bonus versus infantry. They do have a good amount of physical resistance, so they can take quite a few hits in melee and survive. Pretty good melee attack, and obviously having martial prowess really helps them out in their melee defense and their melee attack situation. But of course, their low armor makes them, or relatively low armor, makes them vulnerable when it comes down to how much damage they're going to take. At tier 2, you have Lothern Sea Guard, Cavalry with Illyrian Reavers and Illyrian Reaver Archers and Great Eagles. The only unit that's worth using in the Tier 2 High Elven roster is the Illyrian Reavers. Like at Tier 1, basically all the units that you get at Tier 1 can be worth using. If you want just a cheaper version with the regular Archers, but Archers with light armor, just better choice. But at Tier 2, I would say none of these guys are worth it, because while Lothern Sea Guard without shields are still pretty good, lower range than Archers, sure, but the same damage, basically the same damage, significantly better melee combat potential, I would argue that these guys are not worth recruiting. They're 40 more expensive than, or not quite 30 more gold expensive in terms of their upkeep. They're more expensive to maintain. And I would argue that it's just not worth the price. Unless you're recruiting like a full stack of them, maybe then, but even so, you're not going to have issues with growth as the High Elves, so why not wait until Tier 3 if you want to get them in your campaign? And if you're playing as Tyrion, there might be a reason to do so because he gets a recruit rank benefit to them. But if you're going to get Lothern Sea Guard, I would strongly recommend waiting until Tier 3. But all the same, I personally don't really use these guys in a campaign all that much because I just prefer having an army of spearmen and archers. I find it to be more effective. Hybrid units aren't great in the game because these guys are not going to have the range combat ability of the regular archers. They might be able to resist range damage better than regular archers, but generally you will be outranging your enemy if you're playing as the High Elves because you have 180 range on your regular archers. So these guys having 160, they might actually take more range damage just because of the range situation alone. But at Tier 3, you'll also get Silver Guard and Shadow Warriors. Now, Shadow Warriors are basically upgraded archers that have stock, can shoot while moving, and have Vanguard deployment. So they're skirmisher range units in the game. Really good range, good damage, better damage, a bit lower armor, of course, than the regular archers, so more damage and out-resolve, but a pretty decent melee combat ability as well. So these guys, like, these guys, while they're certainly quite a bit more expensive than regular archers with light armor, I would argue that when it comes to their combat ability, they're far better, but obviously the cost situation does play into it. If you're playing a Leaf Anar, you obviously get these guys in Shadow Walkers because you will be able to maintain them very, very cheaply. If you're playing a Leaf Anar, or for a Leaf Anar's army, if you confederate him, never get anything besides Shadow Warriors and Shadow Walkers because he gets a major upkeep benefit. So for him, it's a very cost-effective army as opposed to getting regular archers. For everyone else, if you need the combat power, sure, but when it comes to the cost-effectiveness of them, not necessarily so. Then you get Silver Guard. They're a much improved version of the regular Spearmen, though quite a bit more expensive to maintain. However, these guys can be much better than Spearmen against magical attacks because they have that 30% spell resistance, much better armor, much better melee stats. These guys will just do significantly better in the later stages of your campaign than regular Spearmen. And by the point that you are running around with Tier 3 armies, you'll have so much gold you won't even know what to do with it. So getting, like, 4 units of Silver Guard in an army can be worth it. But basically for the early game, when it comes to infantry units over here and range units over here, Spearmen and archers with the light armor, maybe some rangers if you just want some extra melee combat ability can be useful, especially in sieges if you just want to send some melee units in. If you're doing that, can be very useful against melee foe in particular. But outside of that, just Spearmen, archers with light armor, and then at Tier 3, Silver Guard, maybe some Shadow Warriors if you just want that skirmisher capability in your army. But for the most part, your army should be made up of Spearmen or Silver Guard and archers for most of your game, if not the entire game. Cavalry choices at Tier 3 do get silver helms and silver helms with shields. I don't really understand why you would ever not get the silver helms with shields in the campaign. Like, they are a bit more expensive, but honestly, 25 upkeep for a bronze shield, which is a bit amusing given the fact they're called silver helms. But for a bronze shield, I would say 25 upkeep is worth it. If you're going to get cavalry, typically speaking, I would say it's not worth it. One skirmisher cavalry unit to draw the enemy to a prepared position if you're the one on attack, and most of the time in the campaign you will be on the attack, that can be worth it. But Silver Helms, I pretty much never use them in the campaign. Unless I confederate a legendary lord and they have Silver Helms in their armies. That's the only time I really bother with them. In terms of the groove, most of the units here until tier 4, are not worth using. White Lions can be a pretty effective melee unit, but it just doesn't fit really well in the High Elven playstyle. They have pretty good armor. They can take a lot of damage. Though I personally find their damage dealing capability to not necessarily be so great, to be quite honest. Like, if you're dealing with Warriors of Chaos, sure, they could be effective. But that's not necessarily what you're going to be dealing with in any High Elven campaign. That's the thing. Like, the units you use in a campaign are dependent on the situation you're going to have. Like, these guys can be good against certain races that have a high level of armor and melee capability, so you need a counter to that. But looking at the situation you're dealing with, you know, in any High Elven campaign, like 2 of the campaigns, Alariel, Tyrion, and also Alif and Arb, they're basically dealing with Dark Elves, more or less, in their campaigns from the very, very start, from very early on. And against Dark Elves, these guys are not going to do, especially with, like, Archers and Spearmen will do better against Dark Elves, unless they start spamming Black Ark Corsairs, which the Dark Elven AI doesn't do. What about Teclis and Emmerich? Again, not necessarily great. Although for Emmerich, if he's going to have to deal with Chaos Dwarves and they're going to throw a bunch of heavily armored units against him, maybe so, but for the most part, the units here are not worth it. The main purpose of the groove is to get Handmaidens and Sisters of Avalorn. Sisters of Avalorn are the premier ranged unit, probably in the game as a whole. They have flaming attacks, magical attacks, insane range, good damage. Like, Way Watchers for the Wood Elves are better when it comes to, like, pure range prowess, but there's something to be said about just sheer ranged ability that the sisters do have with their flaming and magical attacks. Not really the best armor in the world, but huge range, good damage, a bit expensive, of course, if you're getting these. Unless you're playing as Alariel for her army, but pretty effective units. Like, if you just need range firepower, you get the Sisters. Most of the time, you won't really need them, though. Handmaidens, however, are a priority. Like, the main reason you actually want to get the Groove, the Blessed Groove, in a campaign is actually to get the Handmaiden of the Everqueen. An excellent hero. It has replenishment, and it increases your diplomatic relations, and gives you influence per turn, and gives you control, faction-wide +1 control for every single Handmaiden for a special skill they have. And control is important for the High Elves because of the way their economy works, in the sense that if they reach 100 control in their provinces, they're going to generate quite a bit more income for their 2 economic buildings, the Elven Craftsman and the Plaza, which, yes, I do consider an economic building, though it's really mainly a controlled building, though it can generate a fair amount of income in its own right. So that's the purpose Handmaidens serve in a campaign, is to give you, though, that diplomatic relations benefit. Not necessarily for their combat ability. They're a hybrid hero. They're pretty decent in terms of their melee ability. You should not bother with their range skills. Always go for the melee skills. Ranged heroes in the game at the moment just don't handle very well. We'll see if that changes with 3.0. Then we go into the Elven Forge. The main reason you would ever want to go into the Elven Forge would be to get Eagle Claw Bolt Throwers. And this is a thing, by the way, that affects Silver Helms as well. If you're getting the Elven Forge, you might as well pick up some chariots, right? Not the Terranok chariots necessarily, but like the Lion chariots of Crix. These guys can be pretty substantial as flanking units. Of course, expensive, but heavily armored, fairly effective in battle. Resistant to damage, a lot of missile resistance causes fear. Yeah, I don't see a reason to ever bother with Silver Helms. Maybe if I want an Illyrian Reaver Archer unit just to draw the enemy to me, but outside of that, like, I would never bother with recruiting Silver Helms. Instead, if I want some mounted options, I can get the Lion Chariots of Crix, or just chariots in general. I find that the better choice in the course of a campaign. And also, like, if you want some really fast flankers, right, you can always get the War Lions of Crix as well. Mage-wise, you do have a lot of magical potential, but I'll talk about heroes in just a second. When you're looking at the Shrine of Asuryan, Phoenix Guard, they're pretty okay. They're pretty good in a melee combat situation. if you want to get them. So are Sword Masters of Hoeth, like a tier 4 and tier 5 respectively. But by that point, here's the thing, by that point you can get Sword Masters. You typically won't really need them because you'll be steamrolling quite a lot of the campaign. Maybe against endgame crisis, like getting Sword Masters can be really effective. They do have a lot of combat ability, good amount of armor piercing, bonuses to the infantry, good melee stats. Like, why would you bother with the White Lions when you can get a better unit, much better unit, with the Sword Masters of Hoeth? I mean, yes, the Sword Masters are more expensive, and they do require a tier 4 structure, but still, like, their combat effectiveness is through the roof compared to the White Lions when we're looking at just the amount of damage they can do, their melee attack, their melee defense. It's well worth the cost, as I see it. Phoenix Guard, the way I would see Phoenix Guard is not really as a damage dealer, but more as one of the strongest survival melee units in the game. Like, they have expert charge defense, they have obviously martial prowess, they have charge reflection, they have 30% physical resistance, they cause fear. Like, these guys are a tanky unit, the ultimate tanky unit in the High Elven roster. So if you want a really strong melee unit that can take a lot of damage for your archers to kill the enemy, Phoenix Guard will do that very well. And then of course you have dragons and dragon princes through the dragon structures. Can be strong, can be very useful, undeniably so. Usually you wouldn't want more than a couple of them, and dragon wise I would say don't really bother with the dragons until you get to tier 5 and then just recruit star dragons. Like, what's the value in recruiting the cheaper dragons? Like, sun dragons, they're the weakest dragon, they're basically the youngest dragons. Moon dragons can be obviously more potent, but star dragons take the cake. Of course, the most expensive by far in a campaign, but still, you will want to get this structure anyway for the military advancements, though also the lower recruit rank helps you out. Though maybe only one faction wide and maybe only getting a couple of dragons. What about the dragon princes? The thing about the dragon princes, they have great melee stats in a lot of ways. The problem is their armor piercing is just lacking. Good amount of they're a good cavalry from the perspective of survivability, but not so great from when it comes to their damage dealing ability. They do have a lot of charge bonus, so they're a cycle charging cavalry. Specifically that I would aim against enemy archers, enemy infantry that aren't heavily armored, but against heavily armored units they won't do very well. Like, they have a lot of durability, so they can they can do both roles. They can do a lot of damage if you cycle charge them, but they can also do very, very well if you just keep them in a fight, because they can survive a lot of damage. And that's the High Elven military roster. Basically, you can't go wrong with spearmen and light archers, but you do have a bunch of choices, flexibility during your campaigns. And Alifanar, Elfarian, and Alariel do have their own unique units. The Tree Spirits for Alariel, the Mistwalkers for Elfarian, and the Shadow Walkers for Alifanar that they should focus on. But in terms of generic playstyle, the generic army you're probably going to be running within a campaign will just look like spearmen, archers, maybe some rangers, maybe some Eagle Claw bolt throwers. Well, Eagle Claw bolt throwers would obviously help you out with sieges in quite a significant fashion. Now to talk about lords and heroes in a campaign, you do have 3 major lord choices, as well as Alistair the White Lion if you're playing as Tyrion in your campaign, who is basically a legendary lord focused on the White Lions of Crix, gives them a bunch of benefits, but typically speaking you have archmages, princes, princesses. In terms of heroes, you have nobles, handmaidens, mages, and lore masters of Hoeth. Now, I've done a whole video talking about a bunch of races that have really good hero selections and lord selections, and in that is included the High Elves. I'm going to link that video at the end of this one. I highly recommend you check it out if you want more details about their skill lines and all that. But to put it simply, at the beginning of a campaign, you're likely going to want to get an Archmage as your first second lord. The reason is there's a bunch of negative traits for regular lords, unless you're spending influence, which you're not going to have at the beginning of your campaign. What's your best bet with that? Well, princes will generally have some fairly significant downsides, like this one has minus 20% campaign line of sight, or wasteful. Really not the kind of lord you want in your army, though to be honest, this one wouldn't actually be too bad, because while you certainly will earn less money post-battle, it doesn't actually affect your battle prowess with him. But usually speaking, you're going to want to get an Archmage. Remember one thing though, the traits, the positive and negative traits that your initial Lord and Hero selection is going to have at the beginning of a campaign is going to be randomized every time you start a campaign. The one, however, you want, assuming I have one over here, is Ridiculed. Ridiculed does the following. It just increases recruitment duration for an Archmage Lord of Phoenix units by 1 turn. This is relatively pointless. Just never recruit Phoenixes with this Lord. By the time you actually recruit Phoenixes, later on in the campaign, you're obviously going to have better Lords. Another thing, however, you can do, beyond just recruiting your second Lord being Archmage, which would also give you access to magic, particularly useful in, say, Alarielle's campaign, because she doesn't start with magic. Well, she is a mage herself, but she doesn't exactly have direct combat spells until later on in her campaign. So with the exception of Alarielle, this might not be the best choice. You can, however, use the save load character ability. Basically, you can save a Lord in a campaign and then load him in another campaign. And you can do so once you recruit a Lord with some really, really good traits. Of course, the higher the level, the more expensive. But for instance, I would easily pay 6,500 over here for a Lord that gives me 100 unit experience per turn, 10% ammunition. Or the Shadow, who's higher level, has post-battle loot benefits, is almost 8,000, sure, but I could afford this pretty quickly in a campaign. And keep in mind, this is a level 16 hero Lord, but it's also a Shadow. One particularly fancy trick you can do in your campaign, you can play an Elfarian campaign. It doesn't matter if you're winning it or losing it. What's important is you get the Shadow trait or other traits. The Shadow is generally the best one, especially if you're playing Alain, because it gives you a massive ambush success chance, which guess what? Suits Alain very, very well. And you can get Lords with positive traits. You're not spending influence over here, by the way. You're just spending money. So influence is not really a problem later on in the campaign, but early on can certainly be an issue. So just being able to start with a Lord that has a really positive trait and being able to spend just money on that can be a significant upside in any campaign as the High Elves. Just bear that in mind. And also can be very useful, not just for the Lords, but for the Nobles. Because until you get to tier 3, and maybe even the heroes, the mages, they get to tier 3, but really the Noble. Because usually you're only going to get a Noble early on in your campaign, and you kind of want your first Noble to be really good. So just saving a Noble at low level and recruiting a gold, not even spending influence, and getting a really good trait from that is well worth it. It's kind of abusing the game systems, but not really, because Creative Assembly did import the system. It works especially well for Kislev as well. Now, beyond those kind of fancy tricks, what would I say? Well, Archmages are obviously magic lords. Since increasing mage capacity as the High Elves usually requires a tier 4 structure, the Grand Repository, because you only can recruit one mage at tier 3, and you might even start with a mage, so whatever. Basically, you might not get this structure, this mage tower, until you're at tier 4. In a lot of campaigns, like Alain starts with a mage, Tyrion starts with a mage, Teclis is a mage, so what's the damn point with that? But basically, you can benefit greatly by recruiting an Archmage earlier on in your campaign, if you just want the second army that's going to do its own thing and still have access to magic. The best magic skill, I would say, is high magic. Not necessarily early on, but once you get the fiery combination, convocation, it's really good. Now, Archmages are obviously magical lords that are not going to be so good in melee until they start flying dragons and get 10% ward save. Then they become a bit powerful. They're obviously not ever going to win a duel with a dedicated hero or lord, but they can certainly hold their own in battle pretty damn well. Personally, outside of the aspect of magic, and the fact that princes have generally negative traits unless you're spending influence, I would say princes are actually really good to get in a campaign if you can afford them. There's some really good traits, like the experience and ammunition trait in particular, that I can get through this one, for instance, is amazing. Like getting 100 experience per turn beyond the experience you're getting already for Inspiring Presence is actually very significant because it will give you a highly experienced army very quickly. Princes are also good melee combatants. Obviously, they don't hold a candle to someone like Tyrion, but they can certainly hold their own against, say, someone like Elfarion, certainly a Leafanar, Teclis, and all that. So if you're starting one of those campaigns when you're not basically Tyrion, and you just want melee combat ability, going with the Prince can be a really good thing. Princesses, like princes, generally get army benefits for overall armies, whereas princesses, what they focus on is ranged units. So for instance, you have this one. This one is amazing because she's getting a minus 30% upkeep for archers, ladder and Seaguard, and Illyrian Reaver. So you can just make a full stack of archers and ladder and Seaguard for her, have it cheap, get 10% range for those units. The problem with princesses is that they're not so great in combat. They're decent, they can ride the best dragons, sure, they'll have a decent level of power, but they're not on the level of princes. Lord skill-wise, here's some of the things to bear in mind. What is important that lords have is that they get the merchant skill. Like, you obviously want to get Rune Marcher, Inspiring Presence, Bowmaster, all that stuff, right? But one of the main significant benefits beyond their combat ability, their upkeep benefits for certain units, as well as various other things, if you dedicate them to a god, and you should. The best ones, like Isha, can be really good because of the upkeep for Spearmen, Rangers, and Archers, which are the mainstay of your armies, and the casualty replenishment, physical resistance, and leadership. Or you can go for some extra sacking from settlements and upkeep benefit with dragons. Or really go for that campaign movement range, though the other effects are kind of meaningless. But here's a significant thing about High Elven Lords. They get Merchant Lord. And this gives you up to almost 10% tradable resources produced faction-wide. This is a huge economic benefit, which I'll get into in just a second when I start talking about the economy. So High Elves can get some really powerful Lords. I would say, usually speaking, Archmages and Princes are the way to go. Though if you get the princess like this, yes, a princess like this is absolutely worth using in your campaign. She's obviously going to have Frenzy, which is going to prove her weaker melee ability, and that Frenzy is going to help her stay ahead. In fact, in point of fact, since I got her, I might just want to save this particular princess and actually use her in a campaign, like just get a bunch of influence in this particular campaign, save her, and actually make use of her. Just an idea. But you can always randomize the start until you get the kind of lords you want, or until you get some really good choices for lords. Hero-wise, I've talked a bit about handmaidens, but basically handmaidens are the best heroes you have. The reason they're so good is because the influence benefits, the control benefits, the diplomatic relations with all factions, plus the diplomatic relations with all factions they can get through their special skill line, basically. Though you do have to sacrifice some other things, but it's well worth sacrificing. Really help you out in an enormous way in a campaign. Though you do need a tier 4 settlement to even get one, unless you're playing as Alarielle. Alarielle has a significant amount of potential in her campaign, more late game than an early game, actually. Like Alifanar is best early game. Alarielle is probably the best in, like, really a long High Elven campaign in a lot of ways. Though Elfarion certainly is not weak in that respect. Tyrion is okay, don't get me wrong. Really powerful, lots of potential, but there's just some benefits that Alarielle and Elfarion have that make them better in that respect. Makes sense, they're DLC Legendary Lords. Paid DLC Legendary Lords, to be clear. Nobles, really good in a campaign. Give you replenishment, give you some diplomatic benefits as well, though more limited than handmaidens. Pretty good combatants as well. And you can get them the earliest in your campaign. You can also increase their hero capacity if you're playing as Imric and unlock his special skill line. Or if you're playing as Elfarion, you can get the structure relatively quickly that also increases hero capacity if you're playing those particular campaigns. Mages, obviously, just magic users, all these kinds of magic types over here. I personally prefer high magic. Metal is pretty good. Shadow is pretty good. Life is pretty good. Like, Shadow, Life, Metal, and High are my personal choices. Others aren't bad. Like, none of these except, I guess, Beasts is bad. But I do think, like, high magic works in the best possibility. Though, obviously, you can mix and match. Like, have a lord that has a particular type of magic, and then have a hero that has a different type of magic. But you do need a tier 4 element to unlock them. This is the thing about the high elves. Once they get going, they get going. But early on, they are certainly limited in heroes. Lore Masters of Hoeth are basically Melee heroes that walk on foot, they're pretty damn good. They have armor piercing bonus versus infantry, good level of armor. They have the entire melee skill line, and they also have a bunch of spells that are basically buffing spells and debuffing spells. So when you're looking at these fellows, like they have the Spirit Leech spell, the Wild Form, so a lot of armor, base weapon damage, armor piercing damage. You can replenish with that. Mystifying, okay. The Burning Gaze, which is actually pretty crap in a lot of ways, but you do need to spend at least 1 point in that, unfortunately. But they do have a bunch of effects, magical effects, buffing and debuffing effects, and also a healing ability, which is always nice to have for them. And that's really all there is when it's down to heroes in a campaign. I'd really say nobles are worth it, handmaidens are absolutely worth it, mages are worth it. Lore Masters, less so. It's not that they're bad. You won't suffer by having Lore Masters in your campaign. Far from it. You'll benefit by having a powerful hero that can stand his own in combat, though they're not the best duelists in the game. And that's the sad part. But you certainly can benefit from having all the heroes, but I would certainly prioritize I would prioritize in this order: handmaidens, mages, nobles. Like one noble, sure, early on. But handmaidens also have replenishment and a pretty decent combat ability. Mages obviously give you a magical ability. Like later on in the campaign, it's more important to increase your handmaiden capacity than it is important to increase your noble capacity, as I see it. Like, just handmaidens are going to give you more for your faction. Now let's talk about research and economy. Research is pretty straightforward. It takes buildings, and I always get annoyed by this in every race that has it. Like the Greenskins actually had it. It is pretty. Or actually, I think the Greenskins needed research to unlock certain buildings. Yeah, that was pretty annoying. Suffice it to say, the High Elf research tree is powerful, but a lot of it is locked behind certain structures. Like if you want to get military advancements too, you're going to need to get an archive. You don't necessarily want to get an archive instantly. I would not prioritize getting those structures very, very quickly, because while the research is beneficial, usually speaking, it's usually more worth it to focus on your economy. With the exception of trade advancements, but only if you actually have trade buildings that are worth getting. Like, yeah, producing 5% tradable resources is beneficial, and a lot of these research, like when you get military advancements or cultural advancements, you're going to get some benefits in your campaign, undeniably so, but I would not prioritize rushing for them, because there's always some useful things to research, especially once you get trade advancements. Like, the only exception would be trade advancements, but it is a building that you'd probably want to get anyway in your campaign because of the influence benefit and the trade tariff benefit. But otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. If you unlock a tree, you get benefit. You get the things in the tree. Early on, you will start with military advancements. One, you always want to get archery prowess pretty quickly, spear wall, and then militia training for the recruit rank for archers, rangers, and spearmen. This is one of the reasons that the spearmen, ranger, archers meta in the early game works so well, especially the spearmen and archers, because you will get them as every legendary lord at a higher rank. Of the other things in this particular tree, nothing is particularly great. Like speed, especially for Shadow Warriors, not for any other unit here, but for Shadow Warriors, the Shadow Walker can always be significant. But in terms of the other research I had, yes, there is useful stuff to get here. The only really important thing to get in your campaign is precise fletching. And also martial law, because this gives you a significant, pretty decent upkeep benefit faction-wide for those units. But having that 20% ammunition, 10% missile strength is pretty damn important. So getting this eventually, not necessarily in the very early game, but getting this for like late game potential, like say past turn 20 or 30, would be worth it. Though I would not necessarily build a mage tower at tier 3, I would get it at tier 4. Or start building it when you're transitioning from tier 3 to tier 4 on a settlement. That is my perspective, but once you get fletching, that is very substantial. Some other stuff is useful here, but it depends on if you're getting those units or not. Like armor for White Lions, Swordmasters, and Phoenix Guard, yeah, can be useful if you're running around with quite a few of those units. Military advancements free, you can also get quite a bit of reload time reduction for Shadow Warriors and Shadow Walkers, particularly useful if you're playing as a Leaf Anar. If you're playing any High Elf Legendary Lord, it doesn't matter. Like, it depends really on the units you're using in the campaign, which the types of units that you're using will ultimately depend on the Legendary Lord. Like, military advancements for, not really important. I mean, the melee attack and melee defense for lords and heroes, yes, that is important. The armor for handmaidens is pretty important. But I would personally like prioritize some of the stuff in military advancements. One, because you're always going to get those until you unlock anything else. Get precise fletching and martial law in every campaign. If you're playing Ali Fanar and you might want some benefits in your campaign, you could obviously benefit from getting from the Shadowlands in your campaign if you just want that reload time reduction. The reload time reduction is not necessarily the most important thing, but still 15% missile resistance is great. I mean, missile strength is important. Reload time reduction is always a bit iffy, right? Because you're going to shoot faster, but you're going to shoot faster and consume the ammunition faster. Still, it does help with kiting in a battle. Trade advancement-wise, it really depends on the resources you get. The baseline skill is important. I would say the most important thing in terms of trade resources is getting marble very, very quickly in your campaign, because that construction cost is pretty damn significant to actually acquire. Monthly festivals can also really be nice, and healing salve can also be pretty sweet as well if you have it. Cultural advancements, though, which require 2 different buildings, so they require a Shrine of Assyrian, which is a pretty worthless building at tier 3, and you won't be able to unlock the research anyway until tier 4 because you need the Elven Court. These give you some very significant benefits. So the 10% campaign movement range here alone would be worth it. Then Lord Recruit rank, Hero Recruit rank for handmaidens and nobles, and diplomatic relations with all factions. Construction cost, time for ports, construction cost, basically huge construction cost benefit over here. Like, all of this here is worth it. And as far as I see it, it's more important than anything you get from Military 3 or Military 4. Unless you're struggling in battles. But to be honest, you shouldn't struggle in battles. And the key to success in a campaign is actually building a very large economy, because that way you can afford more armies. And if you get a significant construction cost and construction time benefit for provincial capitals, that's pretty important. Like, just the bottom part here, very significant. Like, obviously I would get the Waystone network if you just want to recruit some heroes and lords at a high rank. But by that point, you're kind of already gonna have already a lot of lords and heroes by the time you're tier 4. So just getting the construction cost itself would probably be significant, and just really being able to spread your empire around the world. Now, economy-wise, the High Elves depend on trade. This is one of the main reasons handmaidens are so important. They depend on trade, and they depend on control. Their base economic building, the Elven Craftsman, generates more income when control is at 100. The income it generates isn't significant, but what's significant is that it produces trade resources. So you trade these away, you're going to get quite a bit of money. Each of these elven chests is 16. So you do the math on that. Adds up to quite a bit of money, especially once you get to tier 3. You get 12 chests. Adds quite a bit of money to your economy. And actually at tier 3, like at tier 1 it's only 100 income, but once you get to tier 3 it's actually a pretty decent income that they're generating by default. And then it can go up to 450 with 100 control in the province, and then obviously the elven trinkets add quite a bit more to that. Though bear in mind, you shouldn't assume you're going to sell all the elven trinkets you're producing. In fact, throughout the course of your campaign you'll be lucky if you're selling 60% of the ones you're producing when you get a lot of these structures. You just won't have enough trading partners that will be interested in buying them. Then the plaza, which gives you control, generates more money when it's at 100 control, and goes all the way up to tier 5. So High Elves shouldn't struggle with rebellions. You should get a bunch of these plaza. Like, it's only 60 income at tier 1. It is a bit of an expensive building, but the combination of control and income really works well together. Then you have the Elven Embassy. The Elven Embassy gives you income from trade tariffs. The way trade works is based on 2 things. It's based on trade resources, if you have them, and trade tariffs. If you don't have trade resources, you're basically making trade money through trade tariffs. That's how it works. And improving this by 5% for a structure you can get in any tier 3 settlement, while on its own in isolation may not be worth all that much, it certainly will add up to quite a significant amount, especially in a port settlement. In ports, it's a question though. What's worth it more in a port settlement? Improving the income of the port by 10% and the trade tariff benefit, or just getting the Elven Craftsman and the plaza? Because obviously the port itself takes a settlement building. It's a bit of an iffy question, the way I see it, but it's probably not worth building in the port settlement itself, but it is worth building in a port province. So over here in Tyrion's initial province, I would not build one of these Elven embassies in the port over here, but I would build one in the Tower of Lycian and Shrine of Asturian, and even in Lawfern itself. Like 3 of these really improve the income of the ports, which also pretty sure it applies to the special port that Tyrion has from the start. So economically wise, you're focusing on getting handmaidens for the diplomatic relationships, using those diplomatic relationships to get trade agreements with factions around the world. You can make friends all over the world. You have one of the most ridiculous diplomatic benefits of any faction on the campaign map, because it's 2 relations with all factions per handmaiden. You got 10 handmaidens, 20 diplomatic relations. It adds up to quite a lot. And the sky is the limit. The more territory you have, the more handmaidens you can get. It's ridiculous. It's not enough to overcome some of the highest aversion, but it's enough to really help you get treaties with factions that wouldn't otherwise like you. Specifically the dwarves, I would say, that does help you a lot with that, because the dwarves don't like the high elves. So you might even... Hell, you might even be able to overcome the -100 aversion you face from the Dark Elves, though that is a pretty tall order to tackle. Though you could overcome the -40 aversion that the Vampire Coast feels towards you. Kind of funny, by the way, the High Elves have a -100 aversion against the Vampire Coast, but the Vampire Coast only has a -40 aversion. Just worth bearing those kind of aspects in mind when dealing with a particular campaign and dealing with the economy that the High Elves have to operate with. You need trade partners, you need and the more territory you have, the more of these structures you have, the more trade resources you're having, and so it just starts adding up. The High Elves, I think, had... The High Elves or Dark Elves, it depended on how you played them. But the best economy, or one of the best economies that any faction can have in the late game in Warhammer 2 was the High Elven one. That's been nerfed. It's not quite as ridiculous, but you still can generate a lot of trade resources in a province through lords and through heroes. Nobles themselves can improve trade resources that you're producing in a particular province. So you can get to a ludicrous level of income throughout your campaign. That's how you handle the High Elven economy, just some things to consider. But bear in mind, without trade partners, without trade connections, you will obviously suffer significantly. This is actually one of the biggest issues in Emmeric's campaign, because he's going to struggle getting those trade partners early on, and thus his economy is going to be significantly limited. Anyway, that is it. That's enough about the High Elves. They're a race that may start a bit weaker, though they still certainly have a lot of power in their campaigns in the early game. Even Emeric will certainly does have a lot of combat power, but their economy, their potential as a race is really achieved later on. They're the exact opposite of the Dark Elves. The Dark Elves start very strong, but may not necessarily be so strong in the late game. Control issues, slave issues, unless you're playing Morathi, which is a whole different discussion. But the High Elves do have one of the highest late game potentials of any faction in the entire game. They are absolutely ridiculous in that. Bit of a weaker early game compared to, say, Warriors of Chaos, Greenskins, Dark Elves, and even Skaven. But late game, they might surpass all of them, dependent on which Legendary Lord you're playing, how you're playing them, but there's a lot of potential in a High Elven campaign. One issue, though, and this is actually a fairly significant problem, believe it or not. A campaign is only as good as the climate types allow it to, and as the campaign objectives allow it to. So, 2 issues in reality. 1, to achieve your long campaign victory condition, you need to, if you're playing Tyrion, if you're playing every High Elf Legendary Lord, I believe, with the exception of Elfarion, you need to eliminate all the Dark Elven factions. Now, it's not the problem to eliminate Morathi, Hagrief, Malice is gonna die anyway, so Morathi, Helebron, Malekith, that's not an issue in your campaign. It's a bit funny because you don't actually have to eliminate Helibron if you're playing Asterion. That is a bit shaky, I would say. But they probably realized, yeah, let's not have 6 factions that you need to eliminate, and major factions at that. Though personally, I would rather have Helibron on this list than have both Lokir and Rakarth over here. That's one of the problems, because you're going to have to go very far to achieve your long campaign victory condition. Well, by that point, you do go after Lokir and Rakarth. It won't be an issue. Malice Darkblade actually tends to lose in his campaign because of all the chaotic factions just ganging up on him, and even if it defeats the Demon Prince, no problem. Don't worry, he'll end up dead anyway, because Sigvald is coming for Malice Darkblade, and well, Malice Darkblade is significant. He ain't the Warriors of Chaos Legendary Lord. So that's one major issue. The other major issue that the High Elves do have, and this is something that's only important in long campaigns, but yeah, that's one of the main benefits that the High Elves do very well in long campaigns. Terrain types. You can obviously take the Temperate Island, that is Ulthuan, in every campaign with the exception of Alifanar. But even then, he won't necessarily suffer from taking it. But outside of Temperate Island, Frozen, and if you're playing Alifanar, obviously Wasteland and Elfarian as well, but outside of that situation, outside of like these 2 main climate types of Frozen and Temperate Island, you don't actually have a lot of territory you can take in your campaign. Desert is uninhabitable, jungle isn't great, a lot of territory just isn't suitable to you. So you're playing a race that, sure, you have a lot of territory. Make no mistake, if you control the entirety of Ulthuan and the entirety of Nagrand all the way from here to here, that is a vast and powerful empire. But if you're going for the really late game stuff, you're going to find yourself in a situation where you're asking yourself, what do I do next? I mean, what do I do? Do you go for Kislev and parts of Norska? Yes, please. Let's go for Kislev, one of the worst campaign areas in the entire game. Albion is pretty decent, though. Absolutely. And so is the province over here with the ports. Can really benefit economically from that. Hell, this might be the one province where you might want to build an elven embassy in every settlement, because every settlement has a port, and yeah, that would stack up significantly. Usually speaking, provinces don't have this many ports in them. Very few provinces actually have like free ports in them. But really late game, you find yourself in that problem. Also, you find yourself in the problem that Northern Nagrand, and Northern Nagrand in particular, is bordering Cast Waste with a lot of hostile factions, and moving into the Cast Waste is an issue. This is not an issue the Dark Elves have. The Dark Elves can settle in the Chaotic Wastelands. How that makes sense, I have no actual idea, but they can. The High Elves obviously can't. It makes logical sense. Like, I'm not fond of climate types, but I do think it makes sense for the High Elves to not settle in the Chaotic Wasteland. Like, if I was to change the climate types in the game in any way, shape, or form, I would still keep the Chaos Wastes as they are, to some extent or another. They shouldn't be settled by factions willy-nilly, but I would change other things in a fairly significant way. I think it's a bit ridiculous that you can't settle temperate climate, though maybe that would just be decision by Creative Assembly to basically not have the High Elves just conquer the Empire outright. Still, the High Elves did live in the Imperial land. Like, many of the major Imperial settlements were High Elven colonies to begin with, before the War of the Beard. So, make of that what you will. So, 2 major limitations in the very, very late game. But basically, by that point, you've won your campaign. You might just be dealing with the endgame crisis, and you will have a vast and powerful economy, empire, with a lot of armies by the point you control all of Ulthuan and all of Nagrand. But just 2 things I wanted to mention. Quastin here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.